大家好，欢迎收看今天的节目。在今天的节目当中，我们将探讨一个比较有争议性的话题，就是为什么尤里西斯在刚刚问世的时候会被当成禁书。这要联系到本书的第13章节 Leopold Bloom 和一个年轻女性 Gertie McDowell 的相遇开始说起。当时的人认为呢，第13章节的很多描述是对于年轻女性的一种冒犯。可是，这个13章节到底是否是对年轻女性的冒犯呢？还是在这些文字的背后另有其他的故事？那么，让我们跟随今天的对话，一起进入这个乔伊斯笔下独特的女性世界 ——Gertie McDowell 的世界。Hello, welcome to our episode today. Today we are going to talk about a topic related to why this book is being banned. And it will lead to some topic about women Ulysses, especially Gertie McDowell. So, Robert, could you please introduce some of that to us?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to understand that although Ulysses is a celebrated book and is widely considered to be a masterpiece, perhaps the masterpiece of 20th century literature, that reputation has grown over the years and wasn't particularly the reputation it had at the beginning. And in fact, the book was banned in many countries over its history, a history that began in 1921 in the United States. The book hadn't even been published in its full form at that point. It had been serialized in a magazine called The Little Review, which was edited by two women, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. And in 1921, a case was brought against them under the Cornstalk Act, which was an American law preventing the dissemination of obscene material by post. So the Little Review went out by post. So therefore the Cornstalk Act could be used. And the book was successfully prosecuted, which meant it was illegal in the United States. It also meant that the Little Review had to stop publishing it. It was not available in the States until 10 years later.
1932,
more than 10 years later. And also was banned in the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada and many other countries. So it's kind of interesting to me that when we have a Bloomsday and everybody is wearing their nice hats and celebrating the book, and it's seen as a very sort of acceptable part, I think, of Irish culture, that wasn't always the case. For many years it was considered to be a dangerous book, a book that contained obscenity. And even as it became unbanned, its reputation... There's a very fine book about Ulysses called Here Comes Everybody.
Here Comes Everybody.
Yeah, it's by Anthony Burgess, who was a great novelist in his own right. Wrote a very, very good book called... what's it called? You know, Anthony Burgess' novel about young people's violence? A Clockwork Orange. Anthony Burgess is the author of A Clockwork Orange, which is also a celebrated film by Stanley Kubrick. Burgess loved Joyce and wrote a very fine book about Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake called Here Comes Everybody, which is Bloom, really. And he talks about how when he was a young man, Ulysses was considered a sort of naughty book, like a sort of forbidden book. Like parents would have a copy that was hidden away. Or when Burgess was a soldier, there was a copy in the officer's mess, which people read sort of illicitly. So it's kind of strange and interesting to me that it's become this kind of officially acceptable piece of literature, because that wasn't its history. So yeah, I think we could talk a little bit today about the chapter, because it was a chapter that led to the banning of Ulysses in the United States. And
Which is chapter 13.
Which is chapter 13, the Gertie McDowell chapter. Do you want me to talk a bit about basically what happens?
Yes, please.
So, as you recall, most of the chapters of Ulysses, the vast majority, have a kind of correspondence in the story of Odysseus. And the Gertie McDowell chapter is sometimes called the Nausicaa chapter, because that's an episode in the Odyssey when Odysseus is washed up at his lowest point. He's lost all of his men and he's been shipwrecked and he's washed up naked apart from a fig leaf, and is found by a princess called Nausicaa, who kind of looks after him basically. So that's the chapter that's being paralleled. And in the parallel chapter, Leopold Bloom, at the end of his day, not the very end of the book, it's kind of the middle of the book, but it's the beginning of nightfall, it's twilight, is on Sandymount Strand. It's about 8 o'clock, so the light is changing. And he sees a group of young women with children. So these are kind of women in their 20s, and they're looking after their brothers and sisters and a baby. And he observes them, and they observe him. And that's essentially what happens
In the chapter.
So one of the young women, Gertie McDowell, as the chapter evolves, starts to notice Leopold Bloom and finds him interesting, sort of romantically. Though, as we'll discuss, she's a complicated girl, and he also finds hers interesting romantically. And then the chapter builds to a sort of a crescendo, and the crescendo was the thing that led to the novel being banned. So people considered the chapter to be obscene, ultimately obscene, and it was sort of banned for the protection of young women, which is sort of an interesting thing about the morality. The argument wasn't that this is obscene, it was that it was dangerous to young women.
To young women to read.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I sort of understand in a way.
You understand in a way.
I
Good.
read a criticism about this chapter.
Yeah.
Which is, they are talking about, because James Joyce kind of functioned this chapter in a way which is quite like male-dominated point of view to view woman, which means like, obviously Gertie McDowell is kind of like, very enjoy being observed as a beautiful woman in a way in this chapter. So is it the reason that they think it kind of is something related to the protection of young women, which they don't want young women to perceive themselves as that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And certainly in the United Kingdom and the United States, there's been a huge movement to change the way we think about all sorts of things to do with our social interactions. And a big part of that has been criticising the male gaze. The argument being, and I think it's a very strong argument, that an awful lot of literature and film and television have essentially objectified women and female beauty in a way that is perhaps destructive and unhealthy and exploitative. I mean, what's interesting about that is that those arguments will be mostly made now by people who consider themselves to be progressive, feminist, and as part of a progressive set of views. And what's really sort of complicated is that the banning of Ulysses would have been by people who would have been conservative, so sort of traditional, and progressive people would have argued for a novel like Ulysses. And it's always interesting to me that the women who published the book, both in terms of the new review, and then the following year when Sylvia Beach in Paris published the whole book, were women. I mean, it was women that have sort of championed the book, which is interesting. And I think not necessarily particularly thinking from a gender point of view. I don't think Anderson and Heap or Sylvia Beach spoke enormously about the importance of the book to women. It's more that they were part of a literary movement which was revolutionary and progressive and concerned with changing the world. So that's a kind of irony, isn't it? That in 1920 the book is banned by people who are kind of traditional and conservative, and now the book is not banned but is argued against by people who are sort of radical and feminist and progressive.